Welcome, brave souls. Tonight you're stepping into places where shadows whisper secrets, abandoned walls remember screams, and small towns hide horrors behind smiling faces. Every story you hear will crawl under your skin, linger in your mind, and make you question who or what watches when you think you're alone. Don't look away, because the darkness is already looking at you. The drive to Black Ridge took almost 6 hours from Denver. Looking back now, I still don't know why I agreed to go. If it wasn't for my friend Jake's strange obsession with abandoned places, I probably would have spent that Saturday sleeping in or working another late shift at the bar downtown. I was 24 back then, fresh out of college with a journalism degree I wasn't using, trying to figure out what to do with my life while pouring drinks for strangers every night. Jake, on the other hand, had a plan. He worked construction during the day, but his real passion was urban exploration. He had started a YouTube channel where he explored abandoned buildings, ghost towns, and forgotten places across Colorado. At the time, he had around 8,000 subscribers, and the channel was starting to gain attention. For months, he had been talking about a place called Black Ridge. According to him, it was an abandoned copper mining town, hidden deep in the mountains. He had discovered it while digging through old archives from the Colorado Historical Society. On paper, the town died suddenly in 1978. The official explanation was simple. Several dangerous cave-ins made the mines too unstable to continue operations. The insurance companies pulled out, the mining company shut everything down, and without the copper mine, the town simply collapsed. But Jake believed there was something darker behind the story. He had found strange newspaper clippings from nearby towns, small articles buried in the back pages.
Families leaving overnight, entire homes abandoned, properties suddenly bought by the mining company for far more money than they were worth. The deeper Jake dug, the more the story stopped making sense. Something happened there, Jake told me during the drive. His hands were tight on the steering wheel as the mountains grew taller around us. Something big. By the time we reached the valley, the sun was already hanging low in the sky. Black Ridge appeared slowly as we descended the narrow dirt road that twisted down the mountain like a scar. The town was smaller than I expected, maybe 40 buildings total. Old wooden houses leaned at strange angles, their roofs half collapsed. Storefront windows were shattered or boarded shut. Rusted signs creaked quietly in the cold October wind. The entire place felt wrong. Not peaceful, not quiet in a normal way. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Jake parked his truck beside an old general store with a faded wooden sign that still read, "Morrison's Goods and Supplies." We grabbed our backpacks, flashlights, and camera gear and stepped out into the cold air. Our footsteps echoed loudly across the dirt road. And that's when we noticed the first strange thing. At the far end of Main Street stood a small white church. Every other building in town looked destroyed by time, but the church was different. Its windows were still intact, the door was closed, and the brass doorknob still shined faintly in the fading sunlight. Jake crouched down beside the tire tracks, brushing the loose dirt aside with his fingers. The lines were sharp and clearly defined, not softened by wind or rain. "Someone's been here recently," he said quietly. I looked around the empty town again. The broken buildings, the silent streets, the mountains towering over everything like dark walls. "Maybe other explorers?" I suggested, though even I didn't sound convinced. Jake stood up slowly, staring toward the church. "Maybe," he said, "but explorers don't usually lock churches." We walked toward the building carefully. The wooden steps creaked under our weight as we climbed onto the small porch. Up close, the church looked older than the rest of the town. The white paint had peeled away in long strips, exposing gray wood underneath. The windows were clean, but something strange covered them from the inside. Black fabric, thick and heavy, like curtains meant to block out every bit of light. Jake tried the doorknob. It didn't move. A large master lock hung from a steel latch across the door. It looked new, maybe a year old at most. That was the second red flag. Abandoned towns don't usually have new locks. Jake leaned toward one of the windows and tried peeking through a small gap between the frame and the wood. He pulled back immediately, wrinkling his nose. "What?" I asked. Jake wiped his hand on his jeans like he'd touched something dirty. "It smells weird in there, like chemicals." "What kind of chemicals?" He shrugged uneasily. "You know that smell funeral homes have? Like strong cleaning supplies mixed with something else." That was enough for me. "Okay," I said quickly. "Let's check something else." Jake nodded, though I could tell he was disappointed. The church would have made perfect footage for his channel. Instead, we headed toward the largest building in town, the Ridgeline Copper Corporation office. Unlike the other buildings, it was made of brick and stood 2 stories tall at the edge of town. Above the entrance, the company name had been carved into a stone slab that was now cracked with age. The front door was completely gone. Only a dark doorway remained. Jake switched on the powerful light attached to his camera and stepped inside. I followed with my phone's flashlight. The air inside was stale and cold. Dust floated through the beam of light like tiny ghosts. The first floor looked exactly how you'd expect an abandoned office to look. Desks overturned, chairs broken, thousands of old papers scattered across the floor like someone had dumped entire filing cabinets in a panic. Most of the drawers had already been pulled open and emptied years ago. But in the back room, we found something strange. One filing cabinet stood untouched in the corner, locked. And just like the church door, the lock looked new. Jake stared at it for a long moment. Then he smiled. "You know what this means, right?" I already knew where this was going. "Jake," but he was already walking toward the door. "I've got bolt cutters in the truck." "Jake, this might still be private property." He turned back, grinning. "Dude, the entire town collapsed in the 70s. Who's gonna complain?" 15 minutes later, we were standing in the back office again. The bolt cutters snapped through the lock with a loud metallic crack that echoed through the building. Jake slowly pulled open the drawer. Inside were dozens of manila folders stacked neatly in rows. At first, we thought they were old mining records, but when we started reading them, the atmosphere in the room changed. These weren't mining reports. They were payment ledgers, checks written out to families living in Black Ridge. Every single one dated September and October of 1978. The amounts ranged from $30,000 to $50,000, which was a massive amount of money back then. Each folder had a family name on the tab. Inside were agreements signed by the mining company offering payment for relocation and confidentiality regarding company operations. But what really made my stomach twist were handwritten notes attached to some of them. Notes like, Husband refused initial offer. See Incident Report 7B. Family relocated after consultation with security team. Jake's camera kept recording as we flipped through the files. "Dude," he whispered, "this is huge." But then we found one folder at the back that was thicker than the others. A red stamp covered the front. Confidential, Tunnel 4 Incident. Jake slowly opened it. Inside were old black and white photographs. The first image showed the entrance of a collapsed mine tunnel buried under tons of rock. But when Jake zoomed the camera closer to the photo, you could see something sticking out from the rubble. A torn piece of flannel shirt, like someone had been trapped underneath. The medical examiner's report listed 11 miners inside Tunnel 4 during the collapse, but another memo from company executives said something disturbing. Only 7 deaths had been officially reported. The other 4 were marked resolved internally, family compensation issued. Jake's camera kept recording as we flipped through the files. "Dude," he whispered, "this is huge." But then we found one folder at the back that was thicker than the others. A red stamp covered the front. Confidential, Tunnel 4 Incident. Jake slowly opened it. Inside were old black and white photographs. The first image showed the entrance of a collapsed mine tunnel buried under tons of rock. But when Jake zoomed the camera closer to the photo, you could see something sticking out from the rubble. A torn piece of flannel shirt, like someone had been trapped underneath. The medical examiner's report listed 11 miners inside Tunnel 4 during the collapse, but another memo from company executives said something disturbing. Only 7 deaths had been officially reported. The other 4 were marked resolved internally, family compensation issued. Jake looked at me with pale, shocked eyes. He said, "People need to see this. We have to copy everything." That's when we heard it, the low rumble of a truck engine outside, cutting through the silence like a knife. Jake and I froze at the same time. Then slowly, we moved toward the window. And that's when we saw the truck pulling up behind Jake's. 2 old men stepped out. One of them was carrying a shotgun.
The truck that pulled up behind Jake's was an old Ford F-250, rust eating away at the wheel wells and the paint faded from years of mountain sun. 2 men stepped out. Both looked to be in their 60s. They wore identical brown Carhartt jackets and worn baseball caps pulled low over their eyes. The larger one was built like a former linebacker who had grown older but not weaker. His shoulders were wide and heavy, and he carried a pump shotgun resting casually over his arm like he had done it 1,000 times before. The second man was thinner, much thinner. His gray beard hung down to his chest, and his face was sharp and narrow, like it had been carved out of dry wood. He held a red gas can in one hand. The 2 men stood beside the truck for a moment, staring at Jake's vehicle. Then the bigger man pointed toward the mining office building. My stomach dropped. Jake grabbed my arm and whispered, "We need to get out the back." We moved as quietly as we could through the dark hallway toward the rear exit, but when we reached the back door, our hearts nearly stopped. Another truck was parked behind the building. Its engine was running, blocking the exit, and there was nobody inside. The trap had already been set. From the front of the building, we heard slow footsteps enter through the doorway. The old wood creaked under heavy boots. They weren't rushing, they weren't yelling. They were just walking, calmly, like they knew exactly where we were. Then the thin man's voice echoed through the building. "Boys, we know you're in there." His tone sounded polite,
almost friendly. "Just want to talk about what you're doing on private property." Jake had his phone out, desperately trying to get a signal. No bars. The valley was too deep. The footsteps moved closer through the front room. Then the bigger man spoke. His voice was rough and low. "My grandfather worked Tunnel 4, he said. "Made good money for our family before the accident." There was a short pause. "Real shame when outsiders come digging up old grief." Jake and I were crouched behind a row of filing cabinets, barely breathing. Sweat ran down my back even though the room was freezing. Then the thin man spoke again, closer this time. "Found their backpacks here, Carl. Water bottles, cameras, energy bars." He chuckled softly. "City kids." Carl laughed too, but the sound was empty and cold. The footsteps stopped just outside the back office. Then something happened that I still can't fully explain. Jake stood up. Just stood up. He slowly walked out into the open with his hands raised where they could see them. "Hey guys," he said calmly. "We're just taking photos for a college project, ghost towns in Colorado. We didn't realize this was private property." Carl turned toward him slowly. Up close, I could see his eyes clearly now. They were pale blue, so pale they almost looked gray, like faded sky through dirty glass. "College project, huh?" Carl said. Jake nodded. "We'll leave right now, no problem." Carl stepped closer, the shotgun now resting in both of his hands, not pointing at Jake, but close enough. "You boys need to understand something," he said. "This town isn't abandoned. It's protected." He gestured toward the silent buildings outside. "Our families stayed close after Black Ridge closed. The Brennans, the Washburns, mine. The company paid good money for our silence, enough to feed our families for 2 generations. Carl leaned in closer. I could smell cigarettes and motor oil on his clothes. "But more than that, we gave our word, and we keep it." At that moment, the thin man suddenly walked behind the filing cabinets. Before I could react, his hand clamped onto my shoulder. His grip was unbelievably strong. He dragged me out into the open and shoved me beside Jake. Carl looked at both of us for a long moment. Then he lifted the shotgun slightly. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to get in your truck. You're going to drive out of this valley, and you're going to forget you ever heard the name Black Ridge." Carl kept the shotgun raised just enough to make sure we understood the situation. Not quite aimed at us, but close enough that one wrong move could end everything. "You're going to drive out of here," he continued slowly, his pale eyes locked on Jake. "You're going to forget everything you saw today. And if we ever hear that you talked about this place," he tilted his head slightly toward the mountains surrounding the valley, "well, mining towns are dangerous places. Old tunnels collapse all the time. Sometimes people fall in, and nobody ever finds them." The thin man gave a quiet chuckle beside him. The sound made the air in the room feel colder. Jake swallowed hard, but nodded. "We understand," he said. Carl stared at him for another long moment, as if deciding whether he believed him. Then suddenly the thin man walked to the broken window and looked outside. His body stiffened. "Carl," he said quietly, "there's another vehicle here." Carl frowned. "What?" "I saw fresh tire tracks near the church earlier, not just theirs." Carl's face darkened. He grabbed the front of Jake's jacket and pulled him forward so their faces were only inches apart. "You bring friends?" Carl asked coldly. Jake shook his head immediately. "No, it's just us." Carl didn't look convinced. How many people know you came here? No one, Jake said quickly, I swear. Carl studied him carefully. Then suddenly, a voice echoed across the empty street outside. A woman's voice. Hello? It sounded young, clear, and confused. Is anyone here? My car broke down on the road, and I saw the trucks down here. Carl and the thin man exchanged a quick look. Without saying a word, the thin man immediately headed toward the door. Carl stayed where he was, his shotgun still pointed in our direction. For the first time since we'd met him, he looked nervous. Looks like this is your lucky day, boys, he said quietly. Got a more urgent problem now. He motioned with the shotgun. Start walking. Jake and I slowly moved toward the front door. Outside, the cold mountain air felt like ice in my lungs. Across the street, near the church, stood a young woman in hiking clothes. Mid-20s, maybe? A backpack hung over one shoulder, and she looked frustrated as she checked her phone for signal. The thin man had already reached her. He was talking to her calmly, pointing toward the direction of the mountain road. From a distance, it almost looked like he was helping her, but something about the way he held her elbow made my stomach twist. Carl walked us to Jake's truck. Get in, he said. Jake opened the driver's door with shaking hands. Just before he could climb in, Carl suddenly grabbed him and pulled his wallet out of his back pocket. Jake froze. Carl slowly removed Jake's driver's license. He held it up so we could both see it. Nathan Garfield, he read out loud. 1847 Kaifax Avenue, Denver, Colorado. Then he slipped the license into his own pocket. I'll keep this, Carl said calmly. Insurance. You stay quiet, you'll get it back in a month. Jake didn't say anything. Carl leaned closer to the truck window. But if you talk, his pale eyes narrowed. Well, I know where you live now. He stepped back and tapped the hood. Go. Jake started the truck immediately. As we drove down the empty street, I couldn't stop myself from looking back. The thin man was now guiding the young woman toward the mining office. Carl followed a few steps behind them. The woman looked confused now, uneasy, like she had finally realized something was wrong. Jake slammed the gas pedal as we reached the winding road out of the valley. The truck raced up the narrow mountain switchback so fast I thought we would slide off the edge. Neither of us spoke, not once. Not until we reached the highway almost 30 minutes later. Jake suddenly pulled the truck over to the side of the road. He opened the door and threw up into the dirt. For a long time, neither of us said anything. Jake stayed leaned over the side of the road for several minutes, breathing hard after throwing up. The cold mountain wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint smell of pine and dust. For the first time since we arrived in Black Ridge, everything felt normal again. But the silence between us inside the truck was heavy. Jake finally wiped his mouth with the sleeve of his jacket and climbed back into the driver's seat. Neither of us looked at each other. He started the engine again and slowly pulled back onto the highway. For the next hour, we drove without speaking. The mountains faded behind us, and the road slowly returned to normal highways in small towns. Civilization began to appear again. Gas stations, traffic lights, people walking on sidewalks. But inside my head, I could still see that empty valley, those silent buildings, and Carl's pale blue eyes staring straight through us. Eventually, Jake spoke. "We're not reporting this," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I stared out the passenger window at the passing trees. "What would we even tell them?" I finally replied. "That we broke into private property and found old documents? That two old locals threatened us with a shotgun?" Jake didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. Nobody would believe us. Even if they did, the men in Black Ridge had made something very clear. They knew where Jake lived, and they had no problem protecting their secrets. About a month later, something strange happened. Jake received a small envelope in the mail, no return address. Inside was only one thing: his driver's license, exactly like Carl promised. No note, no message, just the license. Jake and I never talked about Black Ridge again after that. His YouTube channel continued for a while, but he stopped exploring places in the mountains. Eventually, he changed his content completely. Urban exploration became city photography, abandoned factories, old train yards, anywhere far away from remote valleys. But sometimes, late at night, I still find myself searching the internet, typing the same words into Google. Black Ridge, Colorado. Every time, the result is the same. Nothing. No articles, no history pages, no urban exploration forums mentioning it. It's like the town never existed. But there's one thing that still bothers me, something I can't stop thinking about. That young woman near the church, the one who said her car broke down. I've searched for missing hikers in that area, missing tourists, missing anyone. There's never been a report, no police cases, no news stories, nothing. Maybe she really did have car trouble. Maybe Carl and the thin man helped her fix it. Maybe she drove away safely after we left. But sometimes, late at night, another possibility creeps into my mind. Maybe, somewhere inside that old mining office, there's another manila folder now, another document, stamped confidential, another incident that was resolved internally.
Hello, everyone. Before we continue, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, let's move on to the next story. The call about Uncle Howard's estate came on a Thursday afternoon in early September. At the time, I was 32 years old and barely getting by. I worked in a cramped computer repair shop in Philadelphia, fixing cracked laptop screens and removing viruses for customers who complained about every dollar they spent. Life wasn't exactly going anywhere. So when the lawyer called and told me I had inherited an entire property, I honestly thought it was some kind of scam. "Your uncle left everything to you," the lawyer said over the phone in a gravelly voice. "House, land, and whatever belongings he had." Uncle Howard Beaumont wasn't someone I knew very well. He was my mother's older brother, but about 15 years earlier, he had completely cut ties with the family after some huge argument nobody ever explained to me. After that, he simply disappeared from our lives. My mother passed away 5 years ago, and according to the lawyer, Howard had no other living relatives. That made me the default heir. The property was located in a town called Stillwater, deep in the hills of northern Pennsylvania. population around 800 people. I had never heard of it before, never visited, and as far as I knew, Howard had never mentioned living there. The lawyer, a tired-sounding man named Fredrickson, explained that Howard had been found dead in his study 2 days earlier. Heart attack. He had apparently been surrounded by boxes of newspapers, notebooks, and research materials. That detail stuck with me. Research materials. About what? Still, I wasn't exactly in a position to turn down a free house. So that Saturday morning, before sunrise, I packed a bag, grabbed some coffee, and started the 4-hour drive towards Stillwater. The further I drove into the mountains, the more the world seemed to shrink. The highways turned into narrow 2-lane roads. The 2-lane roads turned into cracked back roads barely wide enough for 2 cars. By the time I reached the final stretch, the GPS signal kept cutting in and out. Stillwater itself looked like a place time had forgotten. One long main street, half the stores boarded up, a diner with 3 pickup trucks parked outside, and a gas station where the attendant stared at me like I didn't belong the moment I mentioned Howard's name. The house sat on the edge of town, up a long gravel driveway surrounded by tall, overgrown hedges that scraped against the sides of my car as I drove up. When the house finally came into view, I slowed the car down without even realizing it. It was massive. A 3-story Victorian house, painted gray long ago, but now peeling and faded from decades of weather. The wraparound porch sagged slightly in places. Tall windows reflected the afternoon sunlight like dark, empty eyes, and the entire place felt wrong. Not abandoned, but not exactly lived in either. The key was hidden exactly where Fredrickson said it would be, under a small stone frog statue beside the front steps. When I picked it up, the metal felt cold and heavy in my hand. For some reason, I hesitated before unlocking the door. Maybe it was the silence around the house. Maybe it was the feeling that someone could be watching from those dark windows. Finally, I pushed the door open. The smell hit me immediately. Dust, old paper, and something else, something sharp, something chemical. The kind of smell you might notice in a hospital hallway late at night. I stepped slowly inside. The house was dark, quiet, and filled with towering stacks of boxes. But the strangest room was the first one on the right, Uncle Howard's study, and the moment I walked inside, I realized my uncle had not been living a quiet life at all, because every wall in that room was covered with corkboards, and every corkboard was covered with photographs, maps, and newspaper clippings, all connected together with long strands of colored string.
For a long moment, I just stood there in the doorway of the study, staring at the walls. It looked less like a home office and more like the investigation board from a crime movie. Corkboards covered every inch of the walls. Hundreds of newspaper clippings, photographs, handwritten notes, and printed documents were pinned together with colored strings stretching from one point to another. Red string, blue string, green string. Each color seemed to represent something different. Curiosity slowly pulled me further into the room. The first thing I noticed was the handwriting. All the notes were written in the same cramped, sharp style, my uncle's handwriting, meaning this wasn't random chaos. This was organized, deliberate. On the center wall hung a large hand-drawn map of Stillwater. Red pins marked locations all around the town. When I leaned closer, I realized each pin had a small note beside it. Dates, names, and one word repeated again and again: missing. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed the nearest newspaper clipping and began reading. The headline read, "Traveling salesman disappeared near Stillwater, 1978. Below it was a black and white photograph of a smiling man standing beside a car. Another clipping nearby caught my eye. Teen hitchhiker missing, last seen near local road, 1983. Another, runaway teen reported missing, 1991. Another, homeless veteran disappears outside town, 2006. One by one, I realized something disturbing. Every single missing person had last been seen within 1 mile of this house. I stepped back slowly, my heart beating faster. Howard had circled the property on the map, and every red string connected back to it. This house. A large oak desk sat in the middle of the room, buried under stacks of journals and loose documents. I pulled one of the journals toward me. The date written on the front stopped me. It was from 3 weeks before Howard died. The first entry made my stomach tighten. They know I'm getting close. Found another pipe behind the basement wine rack today. Same diameter as the others. Whatever they're moving through this house, they needed a full network for it. I read the line again. Pipe network? Inside the house? I flipped through more pages. Howard had written hundreds of notes documenting strange activity around Stillwater. Cars arriving late at night, groups of men entering the house, license plate numbers, dates, times. He had even written down small fragments of conversations he overheard outside. But the most disturbing discovery came from the photographs pinned to the wall. Old black and white photos from the 1950s. They showed groups of men in suits standing proudly in front of the house. Some of them were shaking hands. Others were standing beside expensive cars. On the back of one photo, faded ink identified the group. Stillwater Preservation Committee, 1953. The name sounded harmless, but when I looked closer at the list of names written beneath the photo, I recognized them. Not the men themselves, but their last names. Brennan, Garrison, Thompson. Those same names were on businesses I had passed earlier in town. Brennan Hardware, Garrison Diner. Families that were still living here, still running the town. Howard had drawn a thick green circle around the name Stillwater Preservation Committee, and next to it he had written 3 words: "They control everything." My mouth felt dry. I began reading through more of Howard's research, property records, meeting schedules, old town documents. Piece by piece, the pictures started coming together. The Victorian house wasn't just Howard's home. It had been purchased in 1952 by members of the committee, but the ownership had been rotated between different members every few years to avoid suspicion. And according to Howard's notes, they still meet here, once a month, late at night. But the most recent note he had written made my chest tighten. Infrastructure nearly complete. 3 more months and operations will return to full capacity. The note was dated only 6 weeks ago. Operations? What operations? I closed the journal slowly and looked around the room again. Howard hadn't been paranoid. He had been investigating something. Something big. And then I remembered the line he had written earlier. The pipe behind the wine rack, which meant one thing: the basement. I left the study and walked toward the kitchen. The basement door was exactly where the floor plan in Howard's notebook said it would be. But when I tried to open it, it didn't move. The door had been painted shut with layers of old paint, sealing the edges. like someone had wanted to make sure nobody opened it. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter and began scraping away the paint around the frame. After a few minutes of work, the seal cracked, the door slowly creaked open, and the strange chemical smell from earlier suddenly became much stronger. Cold air drifted up from the darkness below. I turned on my phone's flashlight and began walking down the basement stairs.
The basement stairs creaked under my weight as I slowly made my way down. Each step echoed softly through the darkness. The chemical smell grew stronger with every step, sharp enough to sting the inside of my nose. By the time I reached the bottom, I realized something immediately. The basement was far larger than it should have been. It stretched the entire length of the house, with thick stone walls damp from years of underground moisture. Parts of the floor looked old and cracked, but other sections were covered with newer concrete, poured much more recently. My phone flashlight cut through the darkness in a thin beam. That's when I saw the chalk markings. Howard had been down here. Measurements were written on the walls in white chalk. Arrows pointed towards certain sections of the basement. Small notes had been scribbled beside them. Distances, angles, pipe sizes, and in the far corner, I saw the wine rack he had mentioned. It had been dragged away from the wall. Behind it was a hole roughly 8 inches wide cut through the stone foundation. Pipe ran through it. Modern PVC pipe, bright white, completely out of place in a basement this old. I crouched down and shined my flashlight inside. The pipe ran straight into the wall, then split into multiple branches, like veins spreading through the structure of the house. But what made me pull my head back quickly was the smell coming from inside the pipe. It was strong, sterile, the kind of smell you notice in hospitals or chemical labs. I stood up slowly, my mind racing. Howard's journal had mentioned a network, and now I was staring directly at it. Then something else caught my attention. The floor. Fresh scratch marks dragged across the concrete. They led from the pipe toward a large metal drain installed in the center of the basement floor. The drain looked newer than everything around it, like it had been added recently. Cold realization began forming in my mind. Whatever had been moving through those pipes, it eventually ended up in that drain. And then, a sound echoed through the house above me. Front door opening. Not a slow creak, not someone sneaking in, but a confident push, like someone who had their own key. My heart started pounding. Footsteps followed, more than one person. Heavy boots moving across the wooden floor upstairs. Voices, low at first, then clearer. A woman spoke. Her voice was calm, controlled, and authoritative. Check every room. We need to make sure he didn't leave anything new behind. My stomach dropped. They weren't talking about the house. They were talking about Howard. Another voice responded. A man. Garrison already called. The nephew's in town. My blood turned cold. The nephew? That was me. The stopped at the diner earlier, he said, was asking questions about Howard. There was a short pause. Then the woman spoke again. Good. That means we maybe have 20 minutes before he returns. My legs felt weak. They had been watching me since the moment I arrived in town. Start collecting the documents from the study and check if Howard discovered the secondary hub in the attic. Secondary hub? My mind struggled to process the words. If the basement was part of the system, then there was another part of the operation upstairs. Footsteps began moving through the house above me. Drawers opening, objects shifting. They were searching. I quietly stepped backwards toward the basement stairs, but before I could reach them, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The sudden sound made my heart nearly stop. I pulled it out quickly. A text message from an unknown number. Mr. Beaumont, this is Fredrickson. Please call immediately. Urgent information regarding your uncle's estate. That didn't make sense.
Fredrickson had told me he would be unreachable all weekend, gone fishing until Monday, which meant one thing. Someone upstairs had my phone number, and they were trying to find me. I turned the phone completely off and shoved it back into my pocket. Then I remembered something from Howard's journal. An emergency exit, a hidden coal chute leading outside behind the basement shelves. I turned my flashlight toward the far wall and began searching for it.
My hands were shaking as I moved my phone flashlight across the basement wall. Howard's journal had mentioned an old coal chute hidden behind the storage shelves. If it was still there, it might be my only way out without running straight into the people upstairs. Above me, the sounds of the house continued. Drawers slamming, footsteps moving quickly across the wooden floor. A man's voice called out from the study. "Most of the boards are still up." Another voice answered from somewhere near the kitchen. "Start pulling them down. We can't leave any of this here." The woman's voice followed a moment later. "Focus on the journals first." Howard was documenting everything. My heart pounded harder. If they found the basement door open, they would know immediately that someone was down here. And then I spotted it. Along the far wall, behind a set of rusted metal shelves, was a small square panel in the stone. It was barely visible beneath layers of dust. I rushed over and shoved the shelves aside as quietly as I could. The metal scraped softly across the concrete floor. I froze, listening. Upstairs, the voices continued moving through the house. They hadn't heard it yet. I grabbed the edge of the small panel, pulled. At first, it didn't move. Then, with a loud crack, the rusted latch broke loose. Cold night air rushed through the opening. Coal chute. It was narrow, barely large enough for someone to crawl through, but it led outside. Then, suddenly, footsteps stopped directly above the basement, right above the door. The man spoke. Wait. Silence followed. My entire body froze. "Was that door open earlier?" he asked. Another voice answered. "No." Pause. Then the woman spoke quietly. "Check it." My pulse started hammering in my ears. Heavy boots moved across the floor above me. The basement door creaked. Light spilled down the staircase as someone opened it. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness at the top of the stairs. "Hello?" the man called down. My breathing stopped. I slowly lowered myself into the coal chute, trying not to make a sound. Pipe walls scraped against my jacket as I squeezed through. Behind me, I heard the first step on the staircase. The man was coming down. "Looks like someone's been here," he called upward. The woman's voice responded instantly. "Is it him?" "I don't know yet." The flashlight beam began moving across the basement. It would only take a few seconds before he saw the shelves moved aside. I pushed myself harder through the narrow chute. Dirt and small rocks fell around me as I crawled. Then finally, my hands touched grass. I pulled myself out the rest of the way and rolled onto the ground outside behind the house. Cold night air hit my face. For a moment, I just lay there, breathing hard. Then I heard shouting from inside the basement. "He's here! Back exit! Outside!" Adrenaline exploded through my body. I jumped to my feet and ran. The backyard stretched toward a dark tree line about 50 yards away. Branches whipped against my face as I sprinted across the uneven ground. Behind me, the back door of the house slammed open. Flashlights swept across the yard. "Stop! Don't move!" I didn't even think about stopping. I ran straight into the trees. The forest swallowed me in darkness. Branches cracked beneath my feet as I pushed deeper into the woods. Behind me, I could still hear them shouting, searching. But the further I ran, the quieter their voices became. Eventually, I reached a narrow dirt road on the far side of the forest. I followed it for nearly half an hour before finally seeing lights in the distance. Still water. I kept walking until I reached my car.
My hands shook so badly I dropped the keys twice before finally starting the engine, and I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from that town. But the strangest part of the story didn't happen that night. It happened 2 days later. 2 days later, I received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was sharp, professional, and commanding. "Mr. Beaumont?" "Yes, Who is this?" "Agent Diane Russo, DEA. Howard contacted us months ago. What you found in the house, you're not safe. The Stillwater Preservation Committee isn't just a name. They've been using that house as a hub for years. First meth, now fentanyl. The disappearances Howard documented, they weren't random." My stomach dropped. I could feel my hands trembling as I gripped the phone. "Where are you now?" she asked. I gave her my location. "Stay where you are, do not move. There's a safe house nearby, an old ranger station 2 miles north, reinforced basement. You'll be hidden until we arrive." The next 40 minutes felt like eternity. Every rustle in the nearby trees, every snap of a branch made me flinch. I could hear dogs barking somewhere in the distance, a sharp reminder that they were tracking me. Finally, I reached the abandoned ranger station. The reinforced steel door groaned as I pushed it open. Inside, the basement was dark, damp, and silent. I barricaded myself behind an old filing cabinet, trying to slow my panicked breathing. Then, sirens, helicopter blades slicing through the night air. DEA agents in tactical gear swarmed the Victorian house and the surrounding properties. I watched from the basement crack as men and women moved with military precision, cuffing the committee members and seizing evidence. Agent Russo found me an hour later. She explained that Howard had been building an airtight case for months. His heart attack was suspicious, but they couldn't yet prove foul play. The house and 3 other properties were seized as evidence. 23 people were arrested, including the mayor and the police chief. It was all too surreal. The committee had controlled the town for decades, using isolation and fear to maintain power. They'd hidden their operation behind a facade of preservation and civility. Howard's work had been meticulous. His research, journals, photographs, all of it now part of a federal investigation. I handed over everything, trying to absorb the enormity of what had happened. When it was over, I never went back to Stillwater. Some questions remained unanswered about the missing people, about what else Howard had discovered. Agent Russo mentioned that they had excavated parts of the property, but refused to disclose what they had found. For me, the only certainty was this: the seemingly quiet, sleepy town of Stillwater hid a dark, calculated secret, maintained for generations, and it almost consumed me for uncovering it. It started on a bleak Wednesday afternoon when I got the call from a lawyer I barely knew. I'd inherited a diner, the Blue Moon, from my great-aunt Dolores in a tiny town called Gravelton, Iowa. Population 847. I laughed at first, thinking it was some scam, but the paperwork was real, binding. After 6 months of scraping by in Chicago, bouncing between failed job applications, it seemed almost like a lifeline. Gravelton was the kind of town frozen in time. Main Street was literal, a single brick-lined road lined with untouched 1950s storefronts. The diner sat smack in the middle, wedged between a barber shop and an antique store that looked permanently closed. The moment I walked in, the air hit me, a mix of old grease, lemon cleaner, and something subtle,
almost sinister, lingering under it all. Within minutes, locals began arriving. Mrs. Holloway from the post office brought a casserole. Tom from the gas station offered to fix the broken neon sign. And at least a dozen others came in, each smiling, friendly, but their eyes, they were sharp, calculating. They didn't just welcome me, they were watching me, measuring me, judging whether I belonged. The first week was a blur of cleaning, unpacking supplies, and trying to decipher Aunt Dolores's meticulous system. Every inventory list, every supplier contact, every corner of that diner spoke of obsessive organization. Then I found the metal lockbox. The key wasn't with the others. My curiosity gnawed at me, but I couldn't open it. Not yet. By the end of the week, I'd begun serving breakfast and lunch. The locals poured in like I'd reopened a portal to a time long forgotten. Meatloaf on Mondays, chicken pot pie on Wednesdays, and the famed Blue Moon chili on Fridays. And yet, there was an undercurrent. Something about the way the town watched the newcomers. Something unspoken, heavy, like a warning, masked as warmth. 2 weeks into running the diner, I stumbled upon the first unsettling clue. While cleaning the basement storage room, I knocked over a stack of old promotional materials. Behind them, wrapped in yellowed plastic, were newspaper clippings from 1987. The headlines were chilling. Mystery illness strikes 5 at Blue Moon Diner. Police investigate possible poisoning at local restaurant. Blue Moon temporarily closed as death toll rises to 3. 3 people had died after eating the Friday special, the chili. 2 more were hospitalized. Investigations found nothing. No contaminants, no negligence. The health department declared it safe. Yet, a smaller clipping whispered a sinister pattern. All the victims were strangers, travelers, outsiders. I sank to the cold concrete floor, heart hammering. For 2 weeks, I'd been serving the exact chili recipe to a mix of locals and newcomers. I replayed every interaction, every plate I'd served. My stomach twisted. There were photos among the clippings. A woman named Janet Bauer, a traveler, sitting at the counter, the same spot where I'd been serving today. Behind her, a shadowy figure, Mrs. Holloway, watched silently. The air in the photo almost seemed to move, heavy and suffocating, as if the diner itself was alive, judging the outsider. I realized then that this wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The recipes had been carefully crafted, designed to protect the town, to filter outsiders from insiders. And in that moment, I understood the gravity of what I'd inherited. The diner wasn't just a business. It was a gate, a guardian, a weapon cloaked in tradition. The next morning, I made a decision. I would prepare the Friday chili using the safe recipe from the lockbox, the one meant for locals. Every step measured precisely, every spice exactly as Dolores had specified. Hungarian paprika from the Morrison family farm, wheat breadcrumbs from Thursday's unsold loaf, prairie sage ground fresh. The recipe felt ritualistic, almost sacred, each motion an unspoken prayer to the town itself. Mrs. Holloway arrived for her pre-launch coffee, watching silently from her usual seat. Her eyes were piercing, bright and sharp,
like twin knives scanning for error. She didn't speak. She simply nodded at me once approvingly and returned to her vigil. The diner filled quickly, the locals arriving in small clusters. They exchanged glances, subtle, cautious, as if signaling each other that everything was proceeding correctly. They weren't just customers, they were guardians of a secret older than anyone would admit. Then a stranger walked in, California plates, out-of-state eyes scanning every corner. He sat exactly where Janet Bauer had sat decades ago. Mrs. Holloway's head turned slowly, her gaze cold and calculating. The room seemed to constrict, the air heavier. I served him the chili, hands steady but heart pounding. He took a big spoonful, smiled, and declared it excellent. Relief washed over me. He was alive. He would leave alive. The town's subtle tension eased, like a storm cloud dispersing for a moment, but the weight of unseen eyes never lifted. And then the diner emptied, slowly, methodically. The locals departed silently, leaving their half-eaten meals behind, filing out like a tide retreating into the shadows. Only the stranger remained, finishing his bowl, oblivious to the invisible lines and silent oaths around him. I understood then. The Blue Moon Diner wasn't just serving meals. It was testing, selecting, protecting. Outsiders risked everything by crossing its threshold unprepared. That night, I couldn't sleep. The diner was silent, but the weight of the town's unseen gaze pressed down like a storm cloud. Every shadow in the apartment above the diner seemed to move with intent. I kept thinking about the victims, the travelers who had unknowingly crossed the threshold, and the chilling precision of the recipes. I went back downstairs to inspect the lockbox once more. Inside, the second set of recipes sat neatly, identical in every way, except for subtle differences meant for outsiders. The chili for outsiders, I realized, was a silent poison, calculated, invisible, refined over decades. The town had learned to weaponize its cuisine, turning tradition into survival. As I stared at the recipes, a sudden noise made me freeze. The diner creaked. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls. A soft tapping came from the kitchen door. Heart racing, I grabbed a flashlight and moved cautiously. There, in the faint light, I saw them, eyes peering from the darkness, locals I hadn't noticed, moving silently, watching, ensuring I had understood. Their presence wasn't threatening in the way of strangers, but it was suffocating, a reminder that the diner and the town had rules, guardians, and secrets that could not be broken. I realized that staying in Gravelton meant joining this silent covenant. The diner was alive with centuries of knowledge, and every local was a part of its sentience. Those who strayed, outsiders, became test subjects, victims of a town's meticulous protection. The magnitude of the inheritance hit me fully. I didn't just inherit a diner, I inherited a guardian of life and death, a gatekeeper of hidden power. And every night, its silent eyes would watch me, judging, waiting. The next morning, I made my final preparations. I would open the diner, serve the locals with the safe recipes, and ensure the outsider I had served the day before left town unharmed. Every movement felt ritualistic, like walking through a haunted choreography written decades ago.
Breakfast came and went quietly. The locals chatted, ate, and left with subtle nods of approval. Their watchful eyes lingered just long enough to remind me that I had passed the test. The diner, the recipes, the town, they were all alive, intertwined in a network of protection and subtle terror. I packed the lockbox carefully, leaving it hidden but within reach, knowing it contained the power to harm or protect, depending on who used it. As I drove out of Gravelton, the town seemed peaceful, yet the shadows along Main Street felt sentient, watching my departure. For the first time, I understood the full weight of Dolores's legacy. This wasn't about cruelty. It was about preservation, survival, and the ancient knowledge of a small town that had turned its food into a guardian, its diners into gates, and its people into silent sentinels. I never returned. I avoided diners, highways, and small towns. The Blue Moon Diner remained, a silent, breathing enigma, waiting for the next heir or the next outsider to test its secrets. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the town's gaze, piercing, careful, and unyielding, reminding me that some places are alive in ways you will never understand.